several verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is our mainstay, but we also, of course, reference Romans chapter 15. And in 1 Corinthians 10, we hit a lot on Friday night about how these Old Testament scriptures are meant for our learning. They're meant for our instruction. But in Romans chapter 15, does anybody remember what else these Old Testament scriptures are meant to give us? Not just instruction, but hope. Give us hope. And hope and instruction, I think, when you think about those two things, they go together pretty good, don't they? They go together pretty good. When you think about teaching people things, I don't have any kids of my own, but for those of you who have kids, if you think about instructing your kids, obviously you want them to know the right thing to do, but you got to give them something to hope for too, right? If all you do, if you just correct them over and over and over and over and over, they probably get a little old pretty fast. So giving them that hope, something to look forward to, something to think about, certainly I think can be a big, big help. But if you want to now go back to the Old Testament, we've got a story for this morning that I'm going to hope will help lead us in to our sermon here in just a few minutes. But this particular story, it's going to come from the book of Exodus, and it's going to come from the 14th chapter. Now, I know this is a story everybody in this room has talked about. So when I thought about class, I thought we're going to get a story that I know we all know. That way, if I ask a question, you can't say you don't know, at the very least, because this is going to be a story we all know. But just kind of a brief overview of Exodus. Exodus is that book where the Israelites literally exit Egypt. I don't know why, but as a kid, I never put two and two together. But Exodus, exiting Egypt. I mean, great name for a book like this one. And in the beginning of the book of Exodus, we talked about this a little last night, but by this point in Israel's history, Egypt still has their pharaohs. That's who they go by. But there was a guy who was really, really close to the Pharaoh back in the end of the book of Genesis. And that guy was dead. And in the beginning of Exodus, we're told that the Egyptians had forgot about that guy. And do you remember who that guy was? Joseph. And Joseph, that's our coat of many colors, Joseph. Joseph had worked his way up in the Egyptian government as an amazing statesman for God's people. And that's a whole other really, really cool story. But by the beginning of the book of Exodus, he's dead. So the inside man that Israel had with the Egyptians is gone. And if you know anything about politics, anybody who votes for anybody, you kind of want to vote for whoever's going to help you, right? I mean, you're going to vote for somebody that's looking out for your best interests. Not necessarily your neighbor's, but your best interests. Well, Israel's man is gone. So as far as these Israelites are concerned, how did Egypt start to feel about these Israelites? Did they like them or not? In short, they didn't like them. Bitter bondage. They wanted to make the bondage even worse. And so Pharaoh sees this and he's like, man, these Israelites are everywhere. They're popping up like rabbits. We have way too many. And so he tells all of his slave masters and the slave drivers, he says, you need to make their life miserable. Because if somebody's giving you a hard time, just make their life miserable. That's the solution. It works, maybe for a little bit. Well, that's what happened. Did that work well for the Egyptians? No, it went terribly. And ultimately what happens from Exodus chapter 1 all the way to Exodus chapter 14 is a whole lot of stuff. But there's a few big events. We're introduced to Moses, who lives in Egypt for a time. He kind of grows up in an Egyptian way of life, but he's still an Israelite. He ends up killing an Egyptian slaver, and ultimately flees the country, but he comes back after he has a conversation with who at a burning bush? With God. Now, boy, that's a story, isn't it? You remember how God told him, he said, take your shoes off, you're on holy ground? And that's crazy, isn't it? That's a wild story. So that happens. And so as all that unfolds, eventually Moses goes back to Egypt, and God basically says, Moses, this is a very plain Jane way of putting it. He says, Moses, go back to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. He's not going to do it. We're going to send some plagues, but you just trust me and do what I tell you to do. And does all that happen? Just as God said it was going to happen. And then the 10 plagues strike Egypt. By the 10th plague, Egypt kind of comes to their senses, don't they? Pharaoh realizes this is a terrible mistake, and when God's Spirit passes over Egypt, and the people who put the blood of a lamb over their doorposts find their children still alive in the morning, rescued, saved from that death, and Pharaoh and the Egyptians realize that their firstborns have passed, they say, get out of here, lock, stock, and barrel. Don't ever come back. Exodus chapter 14. What finally happens is Israel is on the move. And we're going to read this whole chapter. But don't think, well, we don't have time to talk about the whole chapter. Luke, you haven't even started, and it's been 10 minutes. We're not going to talk about every single thing in the chapter. But this is our story. So we're going to read the story. We're going to take a look at it for what it is. And what I encourage you to do is, as we read it, a few things. Like any good history book, I always try to encourage people to imagine one as if you were there. So try to really give it your best shot. Use your imagination. Imagine you were there. Another thing to think about. Try not to look at it from a perspective of, oh, if I was there with the knowledge I have, but truly try to think of it as if you were there. You don't have the knowledge we do today. You're in their shoes. What would you do? And if you can glimpse anything in history that way, I think it can really give you an edge to understanding it. Because when we look back, that old saying, hindsight's 20/20. We can look back on it and say, well, here's what should have happened. This is the direction they should have went. But in the moment, it's difficult. There were hundreds of thousands of Israelites leaving Egypt. Just from a funny perspective, imagine trying to communicate with the front of the group if you're in the back. It's a funny detail, but how would you do that? Your kid wanders off. Where's Jimmy? I don't know. Go talk to so-and-so. Where are they? They're at the front of the group. We're talking maybe miles away. So, this is, just from a logistical perspective, think of the stresses involved. You're bringing your food. You're bringing whatever possessions you have. You're bringing the in-laws. You're bringing everybody. And you're all most probably walking. You're not all sitting in wagons and chariots riding west like that was that fun of a trip anyway in the 1800s. It was a mess. It was miserable. And so that's their situation. But it's still a good situation because God is delivering them from the Egyptians. So Exodus chapter 14. We'll start in verse 1. And we'll pick our way through this story. But Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 1, this is what we read. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite of Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in, and that I will harden Pharaoh's heart, so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people. And they said, Why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. Also he took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt, with captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. And the children of Israel went out with boldness. Verse 9. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them, camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth. I know I'm saying that wrong, but bear with me. Before Baal-zephon. Verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. So pause there for just a moment. We'll take a break. So what's happening in this story so far? Israel has left Egypt. And who allowed Israel to leave Egypt? God did. And that's the right answer. That's kind of a trick question. I was wondering if somebody would say Pharaoh. God let Israel leave Egypt. Now, he used Pharaoh to get them out, but God did that. And he did that by showing them his power through these plagues, letting Pharaoh and Israel and everybody there know who Jehovah is. He is God. He is all-powerful. He knows everything. If there's ever a humbling book, Exodus is a great one because it really shows us how big God is, how small we are. And as Israel makes their way out of Egypt, what happens with this Pharaoh? How does he start to feel? He changes his mind. You know, ever changed their mind before? Everybody does. It happens every day, right? We change our mind all the time. But why did Pharaoh change his mind? What was going on in his head, it seemed? He lost the Israelites who was helping him. They were his servants. And it's kind of a funny twist because they didn't like Israel because they had too much help. And now all of a sudden, we're talking a workforce of hundreds of thousands. It could have been over 1 million. I really don't know. But we know it was bunches and bunches of peoples just leave. Now again, think about it practically. Think about the economics involved in that. Think about all the projects that have now ceased. Think about the labor shortage that's now going to cause a problem. And you hear stuff like that on the news today. Well, this was happening years ago. Our problems really aren't new ones, are they? And so here the Israelites are leaving Egypt, and they're theoretically, hopefully, some of them at least, glad to leave Egypt because now they're no longer slaves. They're free. They get to go worship Jehovah, their God, and go to the land that they were promised. But as Pharaoh changes his mind, he grows resentful, and he decides this was a huge mistake. We need to go get them, and we need to bring them back. So Pharaoh gets his chariots, and we're told he gets 600 choice chariots, and essentially he gathers an army and runs up to the Israelites. But what big obstacle have the Israelites ran into? The Red Sea. Big body of water, and there's nowhere to cross. Now, in this part of the story, I think this is really where we can see what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 resurface yet again. When Israel gets to the banks of the Red Sea, and they come to the realization that Egypt and their soldiers are coming, how does Israel feel about the situation? We're dead. We're done. And again, from their perspective, even though they could very well outnumber the Egyptians by who knows how many, Egypt is chasing them with an army. You know, they are trained professional soldiers. They're rolling at them with chariots. They're rolling at them with the best that the military-industrial complex in that day and age can produce. And Israel, I mean, they're not an army. They're slaves. They're servants. Some of them are farmers. Some of them are builders. But I can assure you, Egypt would not have trained them to fight. I mean, maybe just as cannon fodder to be meat shields against an enemy if they really needed them. But they're not going to be treated as any kind of, specially trained force. And so Israel, despite being in the hundreds of thousands, if you could imagine being there and you look way off in the distance and you see a big dust cloud rising. And at the very back of the train, you hear somebody say, hey, the Egyptians are coming. And then you play the game telephone and it finally gets to the front. Now, who knows how twisted that message got by the beginning. But everybody finally comes to the realization the Egyptians are showing up. I mean, you could easily have a panic on your hands in no time. And again, I told you this is where 1 Corinthians 10 seems to, I think, raise up its head again. Because in this moment, what did Israel seem to forget? They forgot all about God. Now, you think about the importance of our history and remembering things from the past. There's all sorts of things we forget. If I were to ask you who the third president of the United States was, some of you could probably rattle it off pretty quick. And some of you might think, I don't know if I can remember. Or better yet, I might say, who was the fifth vice president? Well, who remembers those? But they're important. Well, we'd forget in no time. Well, what if I were to ask you, what did you do 3 days ago? What happened 3 days ago? You might say, oh, I don't know. Well, here Israel was just days before. They got to see the power of God. They got to watch water turn to blood. Now, I know you've seen frogs before, but have you ever seen thousands of frogs just take over a whole place, or locusts eat up every single crop? I mean, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? And you think of all the other plagues that unfolded. I mean, just wow. Total darkness on one day. And yet I wonder, we don't know the exact amount of time, but in that window of the last plague to Israel leaving, they get to the banks of the Red Sea, and they just forgot, didn't they? They just forgot. They cry out to Moses and they say, you just drug us out here to die. They said, we should have stayed in Egypt. We would have been fine. We could have just ate there, lived there, and died there, and life would have been perfect. But you, Moses, you drug us out here, and now we're done. I mean, we don't have to think about this too long, but how do you think that happened? I mean, if you were there, would you have forgot that quick what God had done? I mean, I would hope not, right? I mean, what was it, 3-4 years ago the eclipse came through Bowling Green? I don't know if it came through here, but I mean, apparently scientists were looking forward to it for years. And I didn't hear about it until, the year ahead of time. Like, oh, that's pretty cool. And we were excited and we saw it. And I'd like to think we remembered it for a little while. I mean, here we're talking to you about it now. I mean, that was a pretty amazing act of God, wasn't it? How He created the universe and the sun and the moon and how everything could look just right. That's pretty impressive. And people remember that for a time. But what about these miracles? I mean, do you ever thought about how long it took them to forget? At what point they just woke up and, oh yeah, that did happen. I think I remember something about that. It's wild, isn't it? And when you look at what Paul writes to these Christians in Corinth about how these things were for our instruction, don't forget these things. These things happened generations before the Christians in Corinth ever came around. And these Israelites just forgot. I mean, are there any thoughts on any of that? I know it's not really a question specifically, but pretty wild, isn't it? I mean, it's crazy. And do you think we ever forget God today and what He's done? Well, I mean, if the Israelites forgot, just a few days, well, surely we can forget after a few centuries. I'm sure. Sure we do. And so Israel cries out to Moses. They insult Moses. Say, you just let us out here. You should just let us serve the Egyptians. But in verses 13 and 14, Moses changes the game. We'll read a little bit farther. Verse 13, we read, and Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. So Moses, total opposite of the Israelites, isn't he? I mean, just another good lesson from this story. If you're ever feeling peer pressure to do one thing, think about Moses. I mean, talk about peer pressure. I mean, maybe you've got a handful of people to try to get you to do something dumb. Case in point, I don't know how many times I've done something dumb, and Mom and Dad say, why'd you do that? Well, so-and-so told me to. They made me do it. I didn't want to do it, trust me, but there we were. Well, Moses doesn't do that. He doesn't just back down off of hundreds of thousands of people. He doesn't even say, hey, let's rally a defense. Maybe we can come up with a solution. But he says, everybody calm down. You're going to see the salvation of the Lord at work. God's going to handle this situation. You just wait and see. And so there the Israelites were, ironically wishing they would rather be slaves again. I mean, there's a whole other sermon in that. They grew comfortable in their captivity. They didn't want to be free, allegedly. They were comfortable with where they were. But anyway, Moses says everything will be okay. And then in verse 15, we'll push the story a little bit further. This is what happens next. We read, and the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. But lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. And then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in verse 19 we read, and the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. And so it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud of darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other. And so that the one did not come near the other all that night. Now this is a story I would have liked to have seen. Numbers, didn't want to be there. Not a fan of snakes, not interested. But Exodus 14, this would have been cool. Now, I don't like AI and the internet and stuff like that. I use it every day. I don't like it. But there's been some pretty cool pictures people have created with technology to give us a glimpse of what this might have looked like. And imagine what is happening here. The entire Egyptian army is chasing the Israelites, and God tells these Israelites, he tells Moses, he says, Moses, just tell them to start walking, and when you get to the edge of the water, hold your rod. The water's going to part, and you're going to lead them right through it. And it's just like, okay, like that's pretty crazy that God can do that. And then as all this starts to happen, we read in verse 19 that the angel of God, we're not going to unpack that today, but I've had some people older and wiser than me bring this phrase up, the angel of God, making references to Christ and the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 kind of talks about a cloud. Here we're now reading about a cloud. There's just a lot of interesting connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'm not going to pretend to have it all figured out. But if you ever want something to study this year, boy, there's something to study. Keep you busy for a long time. And so by verse 19, though, we read that the angel of God who went before the camp moves between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And as Israel is preparing to make their way across the Red Sea, there's this huge just divide. And to one side, it's darkness. They can't see anything. But to the other side, it's light. And the Israelites can see where they're going. I mean, that's pretty cool, isn't it? I mean, cool is an understatement, but that's what's happening. I've read that story a lot of times, and when I was preparing for these lessons this weekend, that was one part of the story that I forgot that part. That might have been the coolest part. I don't know. But there it was. There it was. And so verse 21, though, we read, Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all the night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. And so the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And then in verse 23, And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. So Israel has forgotten about God. And now all of a sudden it's like they've got a great reminder. Hey, I'm here. I'm real. I am the great I am. I'm going to rescue you. I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to do everything I told you I would do. I'm going to do everything I told Moses I would do. And now they're marching across the sea. Surely they'll never make another mistake again after a moment like this. They will. And we'll talk about one a little bit later. But how could you forget a moment like that? How could you forget a moment like that? I mean, if you just think about your own life, you think about the blessings that God has given you, maybe when you became a Christian, that's a big moment. Now, I know when we get older, we forget things. I'm 29, I forget things. And I'm told it only gets worse. I mean, you're going to forget things, sure. But a moment like this, I mean, there's some pretty big moments I can remember. You know, Danny and Sheila, we was talking about some of these stories over the weekend. I'll never forget when I was little, I busted my thumb on their screen door at Long Hunters Trail. Oh, it was awful. I thought it was going to fall off. And Sheila just put it right back on. There it was. And I get home, and Mom's like, yep, it's going to stay on forever. And I'm like, wow, you guys should be doctors. It's like, look at this. It's like, I've got a whole new thumb. I'll never forget it. There it was. And yet, here this is. I mean, surely, how can you forget? But we'll maybe unpack that a little bit later. But what do the Egyptians do? Talk about dumb decisions. What do they decide to do? They're going to go after them. What are they thinking? I don't know. Now, God told them it would happen. God told Israel, I'm going to harden their hearts, and that's going to take place. But did God make Egypt do the wrong thing? I don't think so. I don't think God operates that way. I don't think God said, well, I'm going to make them do bad. Now, sure, God played a part in making that happen. He didn't force them to do the wrong thing. He knew what was going to take place. Their hearts were hardened by who God is. And so they chase after Israel just as God had said. And so as far as the rest of the story goes, verse 24, what happens next? Well, it came to pass, we read, in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians, and he took off their chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. And the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea when the morning appeared, and the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So, pause there for a moment. So now what finally happens? The Egyptians chase after them. And again, I'm kind of curious how long this took place. We don't know where they crossed on the Red Sea. If it was in the widest part, it could have taken a long time to get hundreds of thousands of people across. And as the Egyptians are trying to chase them, and keep in mind, they somehow had to get through that darkness to get into the sea. So imagine the logistical problems there. The captain's trying to say, go over here. No, they're over here. No, rally this way. We got to go over there. That's where they are. So they finally somehow organize an offense. And they start to make their way across. And some captain says, whoa, look at these two walls of water. And then somebody says, go after them. They're like, okay. I mean, to me, it's almost like a cartoon. It's like the Three Stooges. It's like, well, let's go get them. Okay, come on. And so they just storm right in. And God's in control of all of it. He's making all of this happen. He's making the waters rise high. He's provided a way for Israel to escape. And even though it looks like He's provided a way for the Egyptians to capture the Israelites, I mean, does it work? Well, no. We know the story. We're told as the Egyptians are chasing after the Israelites that God took off their chariot wheels. This is another story for another day, but have you ever been driving down the road and a wheel just rolls off your car? Be pretty crazy, wouldn't it? Well, these Israelites are galloping along. A wheel rolls right off. Where'd that go? I don't know. Mo, where'd it go? It's over there. Larry, get the wheel. Put the wheel back on. Well, there's the Israelites. They're getting away. And they're stuck. They're stuck there. And in one sense, it is pretty humorous until eventually what happens? The last Israelite steps off the sea. They get onto the banks of the other side. And God says, all right, curtain closed. My people are rescued. And what happened to those Egyptians? They drowned. God killed them. God did that. And so as all this happens in verse 26, we're told, stretch out your hand, He told Moses, over the sea that the waters may come back on the Egyptians and their chariot and their horsemen. And that's exactly what Moses did. And we're told that the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, and the water returned and covered the chariots. And it was all, they were all destroyed. And now that story, did that really happen? I believe it happened. That's a true story. And I know, archaeologists. There's archaeologists that have, looked and found chariot wheels in the bottom of the Red Sea. There are outside third-party sources who have discovered these events. Hey, these things really happen. What are the odds of all this stuff being buried in the Red Sea? These things happen. And that's a true story. Now, we don't have to get into all this, but you think about all the cool stories from history you learned in school. Why isn't that taught, And I understand that there's practical things of that, but this really happened. This is as real as George Washington being elected president of the United States. That's a true story. This is a true story. That really happened. And what's crazy is Israel got to see it. And we know they saw it because we're told that they were there in the moment. They were in it. They were living the history out. And even though earlier in our series here, I joked with you how people in the past wouldn't really walk around and say, boy, we're living in a historical moment. But there are moments that are more substantial than others. Some of you in this room, this date may mean something to you. November 22nd, 1963. You remember where you were, maybe, some of you, I bet. Some of you remember. Remember exactly where you were. Why do you think that was? It was big. I remember talking to my grandmother. I think she told me she was ironing clothes. And, it doesn't sound that substantial, like, I was working in iron, but that's where she was when that moment happened. September 11, 2001. Probably remember where you were. Probably a pretty big deal. Nobody remembers December 7th, 1941, do they? Danny, would you talk? You laughed, so I was like, I'll ask Danny. No, Danny wasn't there. You barely missed it. But those big events, you know when they happen, don't you? And then there's all sorts of moments like that. Some moments that stand out to you, and you remember them. They made you feel a certain way. They were substantial events, and you knew from that day forward things were going to be different. Exodus 14. I don't know what day this happened, but how many of the older Israelites do you think sat around the campfires as they wandered the wilderness? And you remember that time that we destroyed the Egyptians? That's a pretty good time, wasn't it? That's pretty crazy. That really happened. But for whatever reason, obviously they end up forgetting. But in chapter 14 and in verse 30, the writer kind of reflects on the moment. And he says, "So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt, so that the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses." So not only did they remember it, but they truly believed, didn't they? They were convinced in the saving power of God. And yet, when we go through the rest of the Old Testament, they forget more than they remember. And in a way, I guess with all the lessons I've kind of prepared for this weekend, that's kind of, I guess, one of my main goals is that we not fall into that same trap. And even though I might sound like a broken record by now, I mean, after this being the third lesson, when you think about what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and he says, "These things were written as our examples," it's so important, I think, that we remember those phrases, that we remember these things, because we as human beings, we certainly have a sin problem, but we have a forgetting problem, don't we? We forget things so easily. And I don't have the solution. I mean, maybe you've got some theories on it. I'd like to hear them. But have you ever thought about just how we can forget things so easily? I mean, maybe it's boredom. A little bit later today, we'll talk about impatience some. Maybe that's the problem. Now you can't say it's cell phones. Israel didn't have those when they crossed the Red Sea. But maybe that's a distraction. I mean, maybe it's ultimately different forms of deceit, right? I mean, if you go back to the book of Genesis, I've never heard it quite painted this way, but maybe this is a stretch. But was it forgetfulness that might have played a part in Eve eating an apple or a fruit? A fruit, whatever it was. It could have been an orange. Whatever she ate, could she maybe have forgot? Now we're told she was deceived, she was tricked. But God told her, "Hey, don't eat of this fruit. You and Adam, don't do it." Serpent slithers along and says, "Hey, you surely won't." She's like, "Well, God said we can't eat it or touch it lest we die." Now that's an interesting dilemma there. I'll let you pick that apart. But maybe she just forgot. Maybe she allowed deception to cause her forgetfulness. I don't know. But that's what happened. So in Exodus chapter 14, the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. They made it. And as we know, that's not the end of the story. Now, for the sake of our lesson, just a few more things I'll add. What time do the classes let out? I don't want us to get a court. Oh, good, okay. We're good. So, that all being said so far, when we think about this book of Exodus, and we think about everything that's happened, and we think about this problem of forgetfulness, and we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, one more question I'll ask before we go a little bit farther. Is this important for us as Christians to think about? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And even though stories like these might seem a little boring at times, because not all the stories in the Old Testament are this exciting, they all play a part. Something else to keep in mind. If you go back with me to the book of Romans chapter 15, just to make sure I word it just right. In Romans chapter 15, when Paul was writing to the Christians there, he told us in verse 4, "For whatever things are written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." When you think about what we just read in Exodus, we've really hammered hard on the lessons to be learned. Listen to God. God is in charge. Don't forget about all these things that He's done. But how can a story like that give us hope? How can a story like that give us hope?
They were in terrible straits, and God saved them.
They were in a bad spot, and God rescued them.
It's a nearly impossible situation.
A totally no-win situation. I mean, they had no troops. They were stuck. It's almost like they couldn't save themselves. What a crazy idea. We read about that in the New Testament. What are the odds of that? And so they couldn't save themselves. And so God was able to do that. That's a story of hope. And when you think about their situation, did God have to do that? Was He obligated in the sense that He was forced to help them out of that situation? I mean, in one sense, you could say, well, Luke, God promised, and God doesn't break His promise, so God was tied by His own, tricks. Well, no, God knew how it was going to play out all along. God wanted to rescue His people. And when you think about it from our perspective as Christians, again, we look back on these stories, and sometimes it is a little scary because God is very serious, and He is very real, and He's very just. And when He tells us in the New Testament there's ways we need to act, and there's things we need to do, and there's things we don't need to do, and things we need to avoid. I mean, this is the same God in Exodus 14. He's not a different God. But we still see reasons to have hope, reasons to not look at God as somebody we should forget or somebody who's a bully, but somebody who does love His people. And when you get into the New Testament, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Jesus shows up, I mean, theoretically, it's the first one. 5 minutes. Okay, we're good. We're good. Everything's okay. And in that story, when you think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I mean, when Jesus shows up, I mean, if you're watching the story of the Bible like a TV series, this should be the part of the story you're looking forward to, right? Because this is theoretically what everybody should be hoping for. And yet, when Jesus shows up, I mean, how do the Jewish leaders act? Who's this guy? Who does he think he is? Jesus, the Messiah? No, this can't be right. We need somebody to defeat the Romans. We're here to establish a new world government. This isn't right. He's not the right guy. They'd forgotten these stories. And again, when you see how these stories play out, obviously God knew this is how it was going to play out all along. This gospel plan was on His mind before the foundation of the world. But when you think about this topic of history and people forgetting their history, the way the Pharisees acted, the way the Sadducees acted, the way the Jewish people at large acted, was in part a huge forgetful problem. They forgot. Maybe some of them didn't know it all. But from our perspective as Christians today, when we think about the things we should remember, it goes beyond the Old Testament. We have the New Testament scriptures. And when we think about things to hope for, I mean, what is it we should be hoping for? Eternal life in heaven. And if we hope for that, is that something that we really look forward to? Hopefully it is. Hopefully it is. I'll never forget, and I won't say his name because he would tell me not to, but he's not here today. But there was a preacher years ago. I was at a I guess it was a gospel meeting. I can't remember. I forgot. But I was at a church service at this church. The preacher got up to pray. And I never heard anybody pray this way before. And whenever people pray, I know sometimes it's easy just to, somebody's praying and you're like, okay. And then you just take a nap. Maybe not, but sometimes that happens. But I'd always try to hear people when they pray. Because I'm like, okay, they're praying. I want to hear what this guy's praying. And so as he's praying, he goes through his prayer. And, there's prayers where if you're like me, you say the same things sometimes. Right before a meal, you hope it's nourishment to our bodies. You thank the Lord for the day of life He's given us. Thank you for your son. There's certain phrases that always stand out. But this guy said something, and it gave me goosebumps. And I didn't say anything, but it was one of those moments where both of my feet almost just jumped in my mouth, and I almost wanted to say, you sure you meant to say that? And I didn't. But as he was praying, he said, Lord, come quickly. I was like, whoa. It's like, brother, you sure you meant to say that? He was somebody who was hoping. He was looking forward to something. And for us as Christians today, that's really something we should be looking forward to, isn't it? Just as the Jewish people should have been looking forward to Jesus coming down. I mean, we as Christians, we should have that hope. And we have that hope through the resurrection of Jesus, that He is going to come back. Now, you don't need to rush the clock, right? We don't need to pump the brakes. All we can do is just use the time we have as best as we know how. But that was His hopeful attitude. He said, I'm looking forward to it. And He'd been around a long time. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff He remembered and a lot of stuff He forgot. But when you think about that hope we should have, the lessons we should learn from, I always found that very, very interesting in light of connecting it to what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. far as everything this morning goes, I'm not giving you a whole lot of opportunities. Any thoughts on that at all? Anything that you're like, Luke, you should have mentioned this, or something that maybe stood out?
Well, it's interesting that the Israelites were forgetful, but the Egyptians were forgetful also.
Yeah.
They had suffered through the death of the firstborn and all the other plagues, and the pain of all that. They soon forgot that, and they're chasing after them. And then when they see them getting away and the parting of the sea, they should have thought, there's something pretty special. We better leave these folks alone. And then, probably in the midst of the sea, when the wheels fell off, we made a mistake. But then it's too late.
They are stuck in the middle of the ocean, can't get the tires on. There they are. There they are.
They forgot too.
Yeah.
The power of God. It showed the power of God and death of the firstborn, and they forgot that.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you think about, too, maybe why the Egyptians forgot. Do you think maybe why they forgot was different from why the Israelites forgot, maybe?
It's human nature problem.
Yeah. We were just forgetful people.
And in the book of 2 Peter, 3 or 4 times it says, remember. Put the brethren in remembrance. And it's just to say,
Scribble that down.
human beings, we just
We believe what we want to believe.
With evidence otherwise. We see that today.
Yeah.
It's the last few years. They believe things that are just crazy sometimes.
Tell people anything, they'll believe it enough, won't they? Was that George Orwell said something like that?